But I think more than just that, which is a very, very ordinary Christian topic, and we will cover that, but I think maybe our interest is going to be in contemporary issues related especially to sexual normalcy and morality. Because, well, we all know that in the last few years, very few years, all bets are off as far as what anyone's going to be thinking about normal sexuality. And virtually everything that people think or practice is considered something that we should be accepting of and even celebrating. You know, even if we just tolerate it, even if we just don't say anything against it, that's not going to be enough as time goes by. You have to affirm, you have to celebrate that which only a few years ago everybody considered to be deviant behavior. Now, I want to just say something about deviancy, because I'm going to use that word, and some people may object to it if they don't know what it means. Deviancy means it deviates. That is, it's alternative to something, norms, usually. There are certain norms from which we all deviate. And if we talk about deviant sexual behavior, that is not in itself a value judgment. Now, of course, we Christians are pretty narrow-minded about what we think is normative sexual behavior, and therefore those things that are deviant would be things that we would have to disapprove of. But in saying deviant, we're not using a word that is a condemnatory word. It's descriptive. It's simply saying there's a certain norm of sexuality that has always been accepted, always been understood, and there are now many different deviations from that. And whatever connotations the word deviancy may have in your mind, the simple meaning is it veers off from what is the norm. Of course, to suggest that anything other than the norm is deviant suggests that it's not normative. And that is what is being objected to in our society today. Everything that was once called deviant sexual behavior has got to be accepted and celebrated as normative now, at least normative for somebody, and they have as much right to say that their behavior should be accepted as normative as more, let's say, traditional couples would have. And this is the world we find ourselves in today. I'm going to begin by simply talking about what the Bible does say about sexual norms, as much as, it would have been an uncontroversial set of truths 10 years ago, almost everywhere. When I was young in the ministry, I don't think anyone would have found it controversial. Even those people who did choose alternative lifestyles would have recognized that they are, choosing something that's alternative to what's considered normative. They would, of course, probably justify it, or maybe they wouldn't justify it. Maybe they say this is a bad thing, but I just can't not do it. This is my demon, But I have to say that when I was younger, teaching on biblical sexuality, what I have to say wouldn't have been even a little bit controversial. Now I take a real chance by saying the very same things of getting myself canceled, from many internet platforms and so forth, just because you're not allowed to say things that weren't controversial before. However, I've really never let that stop me, and there may be certain penalties I'll have to bear for that, but I'd rather be free and suffer the penalties for it than not be able to say what I believe is true. So I'm going to first of all talk about what the Bible teaches about moral, normative, God-ordained sexuality, and then I'm going to talk about the time we live in and some of the changes that have happened in our culture and where some of those changes originated and what they're saying and why we have to respond a certain way to them. So that's what I plan to do tonight. The beginning of this is going to be simply a Bible study. The remainder will be a comparison of cultural changes with and the biblical responses to them. All right? So the first thing we need to get across, and I think most Christians, modern Christians probably know this, but when maybe a generation or so ago, many didn't. And that is that God invented sex. It was his idea. He made a man. After he'd made a whole bunch of sexual creatures, the entire mammalian class of animals is sexual. So are the reptilians and the amphibians. They are sexual beings. They're not asexual like amoebas are, you know. Birds also. I mean, most animals that we can see with our naked eye have two sexes, male and female, and both sexes are involved in procreation, which is a very important thing for species to be involved in, because if species are not involved in procreation, they go extinct. And so God made male and female, not only man and woman, he made male and female creatures. And this is emphasized especially in the story of Noah's Ark, that Noah was to bring two, a male and a female of every species. Why? Because that's kind of necessary if you're going to not have everything go extinct. Now, when God made male and female, he'd made the male first, and he had already made, of course, all these male and female creatures, but when he made man from the dust of the earth, there was nothing that God had made other than man that was a suitable partner for him, the Bible says. So God put him to sleep and made a partner for him. God said, it's not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. The word helpmate has come into the English language very strangely from a misunderstanding of the King James Version. The word helpmate is really not an English word, except it kind of sounds a lot like the phrase help meet. When God said, I'll make a help meet for him, the word meet is an Old English word, means corresponding to or suitable for. I will make a help, that is a helper, who is suitable or corresponding to the man. Now, interestingly, the helper that God made corresponding to the man wasn't another man, but obviously another of the same species, but different in important ways. Now, I want to say that when God said it's not good for man to be alone, some people just think that meant God didn't want man to be lonely. Well, I don't know that making a woman is the only option God had to keep men from being lonely. Lots of men like to be alone with their dog or their horse, or, you know, some people don't want company. And the man he made already had plenty of company from God himself. I don't know if he'd had time to get lonely in less than 24 hours of existence. You know, I don't think it was loneliness that was not good. Sometimes solitude is a very good thing, spiritually speaking. But it's not good for a man to be alone in the sense that he needs a partner with whom he can reproduce. Because if that man had remained alone in the sense of not having a corresponding sexual partner, then man would not only be alone, but he'd be non-existent within in his case, a few centuries. There'd be no mankind. So what was not good for man to be alone is that he could not perpetuate the race. Now, I'm not saying that procreation is the only reason to have a mate. Obviously, loneliness is a factor. Bonding is a very valuable thing between people in a good marriage. But really, many people who've been married know that it's lonelier in some marriages than it was before they were married. Some people who are single are much less lonely than some people who are married, depending on the kind of marriage they have. Marriage is not a guaranteed cure for loneliness, but it was intended primarily as a means to do what God commanded them to do. When it says in Genesis 1:26 and 27 that God made man in his own image, he made male and female, and he said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion over the earth and over the animals and so forth. So he gave them a job to basically curate the earth and the animal kingdom. And he also gave them a command to reproduce, and he also had commanded the animals to do the same. So reproduction was an important part, and certainly, no doubt, the main reason why God didn't make just another man, because two men together could curate the world probably as well as a man and woman, but they could not reproduce. So reproduction was a major factor in God's choice to make a man and a woman. In other words, God thought this through and said, I think sex is going to be the best thing here. And it's not like God grudgingly made it. Everything he made that had sex, the animals and man, he said, it's good. And when he made man and woman, he said, it's very good. So it's not as if sex is some kind of a dirty thing. And I say this because many older religious traditions, even Christians, the Roman Catholic Church and stuff, in some periods of time, have taught that sex is an evil. And it's a necessary evil. Husbands and wives have to do it in order to have children, but they're not allowed to like it. And they shouldn't do it if the situation would not allow them to have children for some reason. Sex is just for having children. And it's like a necessary evil. That's what many older religious Christian ideas held. And even to, at least up into my generation, though I never heard anyone teach that in my generation, many girls grew up in homes where their mothers or grandmothers had very negative ideas about sex. It was kind of an embarrassing thing. There wasn't all this open discussion about sex as it was after the sexual revolution of the 60s. And people were embarrassed about sex. Sex was naughty, somewhat dirty, but you just had to put up with it because you got to have kids. Now, that's not God's plan. That is, his plan is not for us to be ashamed of sex, but to celebrate sex, okay? Just like the modern people want us to celebrate their sexual relations, some of which we cannot do. God did want us to celebrate the relationship between a man and a wife and to enjoy it. And the Song of Solomon, for example, is a book that God has given about a sexual relationship between a man and a woman. Well, we can say a romantic relationship, which also includes, obviously, sexual aspects. And people say, well, why is that book in the Bible? And some say, well, the Jews say, well, it's an analogy of Israel and God as like a husband and wife. Or Christians often say it's an analogy of Christ and the church. Well, it may be, but the Bible doesn't give us any clue that it is. All it presents itself as is a love story, a passionate one and a sexual one between a man and his wife. We hope. It's not all that clear, but it's obvious that he had a lot of wives, and certainly this was his favorite woman. I'm sure it was his wife. But the point I'm making is the Song of Solomon doesn't overtly or clearly make any point except, hey, romance and sex between a husband and wife can really be a lot of fun. And it may be that it's in our Bible. I mean, it's not like we didn't know that already, but it may be that God had it in the Bible because it's one of the few places in the Old Testament where you get anything positive about sex. Because so many times when the prophets or the law speaks about sex, it's talking about the corruption of sex in various ways. Bestiality, homosexuality, adultery, incest. There's all these different ways that sex can be corrupted, and that is dirty. That is sinful. I mean, sin is sinful. And much sin has to do with the deviation of sex. Now, the reason that Christians are negative as they are about some forms of sexual expression is not because we're homophobic or bestiality phobic or adultery phobic or, incest phobic. There's no phobia involved here at all. Phobia means fear. I'm not afraid of homosexuals. I'm not afraid of bestiality. I mean, I'd be afraid to do it, but I'm not afraid of people who do it. They gross me out, but I wouldn't have it. I'm not afraid of them. They don't threaten me. But I stand against it because God does. And it's not because we think sex is a dirty thing. It's because we think sex is a sacred thing, that God made it for something sacred. Things that are holy to the Lord, like marriage is, a holy covenant, and sex within it, are things that need to be protected from being cheapened, from being defiled, from losing their sacred character, which is what makes them so valuable. And so the Christian position is not, we're against sex, but sometimes to have kids, you just have to do it. No, we're not against sex. God's not against sex. God made sex. God thought it up. He thought it was a great idea. When he created it, he said, this is very good. But some things about sex are not very good. That's some expressions of the sexual drive and some ways that people can defile sex. It cheapens something. If you have sex outside of marriage, it cheapens it. It makes it something not so special in marriage. In fact, it's a statistical fact that couples that live together sexually before they get married and then they get married have a much higher divorce rate than people who remain celibate until they marry. And that's no doubt because people who remain celibate until they marry are usually very deliberate about that because they value sex. It's not just letting off some steam after they come home from work, like having a beer. This is something that they value as a sacred thing to bond people for life. And when they don't do it until they do it with their wife or husband, it means something to them, and it's not been cheapened. When people just kind of sleep around or even just sleep with their own future mate before they've had any commitment, they're not involved in a holy arrangement. It's just a gratification of a drive. Now, I shouldn't say that, because I'm sure many people who are shacked up would say, it's not just a gratification of drive. This is a meaningful expression of love we have with each other. Okay, well, meaningful expression of love, fine, but it's not holy. Some love is not holy. But when it is regarded as holy, it is meaningful, gratifying, and marriages much less frequently break up when people have that view of sex. Because, of course, if people will have sex out of marriage before they marry, there's every reason to believe they might, for the same reasons, have sex outside of marriage after they're married. And so sexuality between a couple is a life-bonding thing. That's why when Jesus was asked about divorce, in Matthew 19, verses 1 through 9, he said, in that conversation with the Pharisees, he said, have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one flesh, he said. And then based on that statement from Genesis 2:24, they shall be one flesh, he said, well, what God has made one, you shouldn't make two again. Or what God has joined together, you shouldn't separate. In other words, when you have sex in the divinely appointed setting, it is a life-bonding thing which no human being can justly separate. Only the death of one of the spouses, which was not part of the original plan because God didn't make people to die. That came because of sin. But only the death of a spouse, a consequence of sin, will end a marriage and perhaps permit another marriage. But every time there's a divorce, somebody, well, let me put it this way. Every time someone has a second spouse and the first spouse is not dead, it is because somebody sinned grievously. Either they had a legitimate divorce or remarriage because their spouse sinned grievously by committing adultery, or they themselves sinned grievously by divorcing and remarrying. You just can't get into a second marriage while your other spouse is alive without it being a serious sin on somebody's part. You can't have a holy situation where everybody is living godly and holy, and yet a man who married one woman and she's still alive, he can somehow end up married to a second woman. That's just not, it's a life-bonding thing. And the reason that Christianity condemns what we call fornication, the Bible has a broader definition of fornication, but we usually think of fornication as just premarital sex, is because it is engaging in a activity that is designed to be life-bonding, but doing so without a life-bonding intention. In other words, it's using sex for something that it's not made for, all right? Now, in what sense are a couple one flesh when they are married and when they consummate the marriage? Well, I think there's a number of ways this can be understood, and it's not explained in the Bible. I think that people who think about it have thought of a number of ways that this is so. One is that a couple becomes a new organism. Paul describes it as like a head and a body. That the man is the head of the wife, and just like Christ is the head of the church. And the wife is subject to her husband just like the body is subject to Christ the head. So the idea here is God has us pictured as a single organism, a corporate organism. The two become one. They're still two in a certain sense, but they're one in a unique sense. They are now bonded for life just like every part of your body is. If you cut your head off, that's the end. You keep your head, your body intact, that's how things were made to be. And therefore, the couple becomes a new organism, a head and a body of a new individual. That does not mean that they lose their individuality in many other respects. But it means as far as God's concerned, they're, not to use a term that sounds negative, but they're stuck. They're stuck with each other. Hopefully they don't feel stuck. Hopefully they can appreciate the value of being stuck with each other and say, I'd rather never be anything other than stuck to my spouse. That certainly is, frankly, my attitude. In fact, that's always been my attitude toward marriage. My parents, I was fortunate, had a very wonderful marriage, married for 71 years until my dad died earlier this year, and they were happy, affectionate, held hands, joked around together. I mean, they're like a young dating couple all through their whole marriage. So when a person grows up in that environment, they have a positive view of marriage. Obviously, many people have been raised in homes where the parents were not a very good example of marriage and didn't make marriage look like a very desirable thing. And no doubt the proliferation of divorces in our society is one of the reasons that so many young people have decided not to marry, but just to shack up. I mean, I don't want to be stuck with the person. Look, my dad stuck with his wife, and boy, they're not happy. And so when Christians do not function as a married couple, as one flesh in the way that God described, it cheapens or renders marriage unpleasant even to the children. And it may corrupt the children's view of marriage. Many people I know who have divorced are from homes where they were raised by parents who were divorced. The children of divorced parents are in a much more high-risk group to experience divorce themselves. And it's not hard to understand why. It's hard to commit. If you were raised in a home where the most committed relationship in the world was not really a committed relationship, they weren't committed. Marriage is for life. And there's no unsinful way to escape a marriage other than through natural death or whatever way they die. So one flesh is one organism with a head and a body. So teaches the Bible. Very unpopular to think of marriage in that way now. But that's, lots of things about Christianity are unpopular today. Who cares? Our attitude has got to be, who cares if it's popular? The truth is not always popular, but it's always true, and it's always advantageous to be in touch with the truth. The truth makes you free. People who reject the truth have to think of lies that will work out for them, but lies are not in touch with reality. That's the definition of a lie. It's not in sync with reality. And when you're living out of sync with reality because you don't want to live by the truth, when you're out of sync with reality, reality chews you up and spits you out because reality is sovereign. And if you don't adjust yourself and your ways to reality, which is what God describes, there are consequences. You may not feel them in your life, but your kids will, or others will. I mean, when people treat marriage the way that our society treats it now, then, of course, marriage falls on, and sexuality falls on the same hard times that we find it on in our society. It's a cause and effect thing. And so there's another sense in which we're one flesh, and that's, as married couples know, there's a sort of a psycho-spiritual kind of bond that happens between people when they mate in that way. That's why it has to be for life, because the breaking of that bond is devastating to all but the most hardened. I've known people who are so hardened about this, they can, like prostitutes. They can sleep with someone different every night. They apparently don't feel it anymore. R.C. Sproul said that he was not raised a Christian, and when he was a teenager, he had his first sexual experience. He was so bothered by it, he went home and threw up. But he just kept doing it. He said within a short time, he didn't feel a thing. Well, that's not a positive development when you can trash your sexuality like that and not feel a thing. It's like having a tumor in your head and you don't have a headache. A headache is, you don't like headaches, but headaches are good for you if they're telling you there's a tumor in there. You got to look into that. And so also the guilt felt by people who first violate themselves and someone else sexually, you don't want that to go away. Well, they do want it to go away if they want to keep doing the thing, but it's a warning. It's saying this is not the way behavior is supposed to go. This is not the way you're supposed to do this. But you can certainly silence your conscience. You can callous it. I used to play guitar when I was younger, a lot more than I do now. I still have a little bit of the calluses on my fingers, but I definitely remember when I first learned, and you, probably a certain large percentage of you know this, when you first pick up a guitar to learn it, after about 20 seconds, you think, ow. This is cutting into my fingers, my soft little fingers, my sensitive fingertips. But if you say, I'm going to learn guitar no matter what, you keep doing it, you keep hurting them. But they don't hurt as much the second or third or fourth. And the 10th time, you've already got calluses there. The skin is so thick you can't feel a thing. That happens with the conscience too. That's what being hard-hearted means. First time you do a sinful thing, ouch. I know I'm really out of sync with right behavior. But if I keep doing it, the conscience gets numbed. It gets desensitized. It gets its calluses. Then you can do it all you want, and you're killing yourself spiritually and maybe doing serious harm to others as well, but you don't know and you don't care. And that's the danger. You don't want to get hard-hearted, because hard-hearted doesn't mean you're not doing something hurtful. It just means you're doing something hurtful, and the natural alarms that you normally heed, you're not heeding them, and they've gone off. The electricity is no longer feeding to the alarm system. And so there is, in all normal sexuality, a bond. And, I had a youth pastor tell me once, he said, when a girl comes in for counsel and she's just broken up with her boyfriend and she's devastated and so forth, and he says, well, how long ago did you guys break up? She says, 6 months ago. He says, well, you were sleeping together, weren't you? Because if you hadn't been sleeping together, you would have gotten over it a lot quicker than that. I can understand. You sleep together, you may never feel like you've fully gotten over it when you break up, because there's a bond, a psycho-spiritual bond that binds people into one flesh. I mean, the reality that God announced, and which we can hardly explain, is felt. That's why sometimes men and women kill their spouses when they find out they've slept with someone else. And sometimes they kill the other person too. And sometimes they kill themselves next. I mean, it's so, the betrayal, the tearing apart of what God joined together is not natural. People can get used to it, but it's not a good thing to get used to. And oneness is that spiritual bond that exists between a man and wife. Now, and the third thing I would say that makes it a one flesh, marriage produces one flesh, is that children who come from a marriage, from a sexual relationship in a marriage, a child is one person, but he's got parts of both other people. The two have become, in a very real sense, another one flesh in their baby. It's an amazing thing that God has done. And I have no idea how evolutionists who don't believe in God can ever live with the awareness of how miraculous it is, what takes place just with the conception of any higher mammal, the zygote, and how that happens and how it attaches and how it develops. And, how could that, without intelligent design, there's just no way that can happen. And, usually atheists just content themselves not to think much about it, they say we have a God of the gaps, which means the gaps in our knowledge, when we can't explain something else, we just put God in there. God did that. Yeah, well, they have an evolution of the gaps. There's a million things they can't explain, but evolution did it. So they've got evolution of the gaps, and they've got as many gaps as anyone else does. There's lots of things people don't understand, but God is the only theorem that really makes any sense. Now, that being so, we need to understand that marriage, this sacred union, this lifelong monogamous union that God intends for, one reason to be lifelong is so that there's a safe place for children to come into the world and be nurtured. Now, we have found, unfortunately, the hard way that kids can survive in a single-parent home. Sometimes there's no avoiding it. A man dies in war and the mother's left to raise the kids alone. With the death of a spouse, we're definitely in a very subnormal situation, and people can survive it. But when there's divorce, it's worse. I know, because I've been divorced, not by my choice, very much against my choice. I was abandoned by a wife who wanted monogamy, was not okay with her. And I married again, and my second wife was killed in an accident shortly after we got married. So I've been widowed and divorced, and I'll tell you what, widowed is a lot easier. And everyone I know who's been widowed and divorced says the same thing. When you're widowed, at least if your spouse was a Christian, it's, first of all, they didn't want to die. They didn't reject you, you know. They didn't betray you. And you're not going to see them on the arm of somebody else, you know, sometime in the future. You're not going to have to fight over the kids with them. You've got the custody automatically, you know. There's all kinds of things that go with a divorce that are horrendous to go through. Someone has said, and I agree with them, that adultery, and by the way, divorce without grounds essentially becomes adultery according to Jesus. But adultery is the most cruel, nonviolent act that a person can commit against another person. And anyone who's been through a divorce they didn't want knows that's true, and knows why many weaker people end up killing their spouse and their spouse's lover and themselves because they simply can't stand the pain. That's because of that bond. But when kids are raised by one parent, they're raised by a parent who's struggling. It's like trying to fly a plane with one wing off. You know, no wonder they crash and burn so often. Marriage has got to be upheld, and sexuality has got to be maintained as that which belongs to marriage and in marriage faithfully and only in marriage. Everything else, you might be forgiven for sins of sex. I know almost everyone I know has been who's a Christian. You can be forgiven, but you can't be unscathed. You can't be unchanged by having cheapened or perverted this sacred thing. And everybody knows it's sacred. You know, if someone steals your car, you're not even tempted to go out and blow their brains out. They take your spouse, and that thought definitely arises, and sometimes you have to be a pretty strong person to say, no, that's not going to happen. You know? But it's like if someone steals your house through title theft, home title theft, that's a big crime, or your car, or your bank account. Of course you're going to be upset about that. It's not anything like someone stealing your wife or your husband. Not even close. Not in the same category, because sex is very, very different, because God made it to be different. He made it to be a dynamic, spiritually, you know, profound human experience. And it's a wonderful thing when you have it in the right place. When it's not in the right place, yeah, you know, you can live with it. You can even maybe enjoy it at a level, but you cannot avoid the harm and damage that's done by your choices. Now, what Jesus said about sex is what was already believed by the Jews of his time, because they were instructed from God's laws about these things. And that is that the only legitimate exercise of sexuality is in a godly marriage. Now, a godly marriage, Jesus defined that too. He said, didn't you read what God did at the beginning? God made male and female and said, for this cause, a man will leave his father and cleave to his wife, which is a feminine word, a woman, and they'll be one flesh. That's what marriage is. And that's the only environment in which biblical morality recognizes the legitimacy of a sexual relationship. Within that relationship, we don't know of any restrictions. Outside that relationship, everything is restricted. And that's why when homosexuality began to be normalized more in my lifetime, in my later lifetime, because it's been quite recent, to tell you the truth. And Christians, you know, spoke out against it. People say, why are you such a hater? Why are you such a homophobe? Well, no, I don't hate homosexuals. I'm not even afraid of them. I'm not a homophobe. I'm against sexuality outside of marriage. I'm as much against adultery or incest or, you know, frankly, heterosexual fornication. I'm against those as much as I'm against homosexuality. You know, obviously, homosexuality was in the closet a lot when I was a younger person, so it's more surprising to see it out. You know, it's a little more unfamiliar to someone of my generation, but we're getting used to the fact there's a lot of them out there, and okay, so there's another group of people who have sex outside of biblical marriage. So it's just another kind of fornication, and I'm against fornication. Not that anyone has to care what I'm against, but I'm against it because The Bible is against it. Jesus said that fornication is an evil, corrupting thing. Sometimes people say, Jesus never said anything about homosexuality, but you have to understand the word fornication that he used, porneia, is a very common Greek word even in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament was translated into Greek 300 years before Christ, and there is a Greek Old Testament, originally written in Hebrew, but was translated into Greek before Christ's time. And in the Greek language, the word porneia sounds a lot like one of our English words, doesn't it? Porneia. It's the word that we translate as fornication in King James English. Modern translations usually change it to sexual immorality. Why? Because in modern English, we usually think of fornication just means, a couple who's not married having sex outside of marriage. And usually the assumption is they're a heterosexual couple, a straight couple. But in the Bible, porneia refers to every kind of sexual deviancy. That is, anything where two people are having sex and they're not biblically married to each other. And so in the book of Jude, the word porneia is used to refer to the sins of the Sodomites. It says they committed fornication. In 1 Corinthians 5, verse 1, Paul says that the church in Corinth was wrongfully enduring, a couple that were involved in fornication. It happened to be an incestuous relationship he's talking about. It's clear that fornication means any kind of sexual deviancy, and so it is used in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the word porneia is used of adultery. Now, there's another word for adultery, and there's certainly another word for homosexuality, another word for bestiality, but the point is, all these are under the umbrella term porneia. The only thing that isn't porneia sexually is sex within a biblically defined marriage. Now, I keep saying a biblical marriage or biblically defined marriage because now we have other definitions of marriage that are not biblically defined. And this confuses people sometimes. They say, well, but the state has married them. How can we not say that's legitimate? Well, when did the state ever have the authority to decide what marriage is? Our government has given up its credibility on the subject of defined marriage back in the 60s when they made no-fault divorce. For 50 years, we have had a definition of marriage officially, legally, that has nothing to do with the definition of marriage in the Bible. Because in the Bible, you cannot get a divorce if there's no fornication on the part of your partner. In our society, you can get divorced any reason you want to. Marriage is the only contract which the government makes at the courthouse, but they won't defend it. You make a financial contract with someone, and if you violate that, they can take you to court and make you pay it. For some reason, a far more important contract, one that the violation of it injures everybody except the person who's initiating the violation, and then it injures them more than they know. The state has no interest in defending that contract. Although they make the contract, they don't defend it. So I think, what do they know? They gave up credibility. They have no competence to define what marriage is. So if now, 40-something years later, they say, oh, well, two people who love each other who are same sex, that can be marriage too. Yeah, says you, not says God. I don't care what the state says about that. There are people who are remarried, straight people married to a second spouse when they had no legitimate divorce from their first spouse. The state gave them a marriage license. They're supposedly married. Jesus says, no, that's adultery. There's a big difference between adultery and marriage. In fact, they're opposites. Our nation has lost all sense of what marriage is, and Christians have no business allowing the state to define it for us when God has defined it. And therefore, though we live in an age of same-sex marriage and of illegitimately divorced people in second and third marriages and so forth, who cares? We're not listening to them. We're listening to the King. And he says that is adultery, that is sin, that is an abomination. Now, let me just make sure, because I did link homosexuality in there. Again, I didn't plan for this lecture to be about homosexuality, but obviously it's one of the factors in the whole subject of Christian attitudes towards sexual morality, and it's a factor of growing interest in our society. And many Christians are finding themselves in a hard position because they have nieces or daughters or sons who are getting married to someone of the same sex, and then they're saying, come on, Mom, come on, Auntie, come to my wedding. And these Christian people are saying, what am I supposed to do? I mean, is this normative now? They're getting into a legal relationship. How can I object? Or should I object? What should I say? What should I do? Or there's people saying, you know, I want you to call me by these other pronouns now that reflect a different gender identity than the one I've always had before and the one that you've always known me have. And some parents are facing that too. In fact, you may have heard some parents in Canada they lost the custody of their daughter because they did not accommodate her wish to be called by male pronouns. And as Canada goes, America goes too, eventually, in terms of liberalism and leftism and things like that. But the truth is, that kind of stuff is already on the table here. You know, people wanting to change their gender identity, they want you to celebrate that and go along with it. You know, well, why should I? Well, you're supposed to respect my feelings. Well, are you supposed to respect mine? You know, if you are, frankly, inclined toward homosexuality, I'm not going to condemn you for that. That's between you and God. Of course, if you're a Christian doing it, you have to be subject to church discipline, because so does anybody who commits any kind of fornication. But I'm not going to go out and make laws against you being a homosexual. But you shouldn't make laws against me being a Christian either. There's 3% of the population, allegedly, that are like you, and 97% of the population think like I do, or used to. And why shouldn't the feelings of those 97% be brought into consideration? Why can't we accept each other and give each other the right to do what they want to do? I don't approve of or like the idea that you want to change your gender, because I don't think you literally can. I think that's a delusion you're in. But if you do, I'm not going to hate you. I don't hate anybody. But why do you hate me if I don't celebrate that with you and come over to your side on this? I'm not under obligation to do so. And yet, see, this is the thing that Christians are facing in our society now as never before. And so what about homosexuality? Well, of course, in case you don't know, the Bible does condemn homosexual acts. And I think we need to make sure we know the difference between a homosexual act and a homosexual temptation. There are people, I don't know if they were born that way or if they became that way through childhood trauma. There's different theories. There's debates over that. Some people say they're born homosexual. Some people, think it's mainly the result of some really bad experiences they had when they were young, maybe molestation, who knows. But the point is, for whatever reason, there are people who they cannot remember a time when they weren't attracted to the same sex. If it happened through molestation, it happened even before they were old enough to have had any normal sexual feelings. So the only sexual feelings that they associate with are with this kind of deviancy. Now, I don't care why you feel that way. And I want to say I don't even care that you feel that way, but I do, because I'm sorry for you. You've got a harder life than I have. And I'm always sorry for people who have harder lives than I have. I really have a lot of pity for someone who struggles with that. But you can be a good Christian and have one of the major struggles in your life is you're struggling against same-sex attraction and see it as a temptation. You know, I'm not attracted to same-sex, but I've always been attracted to the opposite sex, and I've spent a lot of my adult life single. After my wife ran off, she left me with 4 kids at home. I was single for 10 years, growing up until they were grown up. And I didn't like being single. That's not my choice to be single. I fought it as much as I could, but the courts won't fight for the innocent party. They only fight for the guilty party, which is they've been doing that for years, but sort of that's what they do in criminal justice in general nowadays too. The innocent, the law enforcement people, they're the ones who stand trial in a situation where a criminal gets killed if he happens to be of a controversial category. The point I'm making, though, is that we have to recognize that we are not going to be able to take a Christian stand without serious opposition. The culture is changing. And it's not just changing to a place where it rejects Christian morality and wants to substitute with another morality, but where it wants Christian morality to be called immorality. They want us to be the bad guys, the haters, the radicals. We are the bad guys because we haven't changed with them. A lot of the people that are against us used to think like we did, like yesterday, you know? But this radical change has happened, and now those who haven't made that change are considered to be radicals, extremists, haters. And I have to say, a lot of people who are religious have apparently been haters. I mean, when you see a group of people carrying signs that say God hates fags, you know you're looking at haters. And these people, unfortunately, belong to a church. And so these are the ones who get the media coverage. And frankly, most of the people I've known in my life have been Christians. I've led Christian schools. I teach in Christian schools. I was raised in a Christian home. I've just known a lot more Christians than non-Christians. And I've never met a Christian that ever I picked up on it that they hated gays. I've not met. I'm not saying they're not out there, but they are. The ones who are must be like, you know, the guys who have 3 teeth in their head and live in the Ozarks or something. You know, they're people who don't have any, intelligence, or at least not the Spirit of Christ in them. Because Christ didn't hate sinners. He was like a doctor. Doctors don't hate their patients. They have compassion on them, but they recognize they're sick. And that's what Jesus was like when he went to the prostitutes, when he went to the tax collectors. If there were any homosexuals, they were probably in that same community because all of them would have been thrown in the same bag by the Pharisees and by the Jewish culture of his time. You know, when he went to the red light district, there may have been some gays there, we don't know, but there were everybody that society rejected as an outcast. They were there, and Jesus was there. The Pharisees criticized him, and he said, well, those who are well don't need a physician. Those who are sick do. I'm coming to them because they need a physician. I'm not their enemy. Jesus is not the enemy of sinners. God is not the enemy of sinners. Ultimately, if they don't repent, they will have to answer to a just judgment. But God loves sinners, and that's why he sent his son. Sometimes we think, well, Jesus was nice to sinners, but God, boy, he's an angry old guy. Good thing Jesus came along to protect us from the wrath of his dad. I'm glad we have an advocate there. And we think of God as the one who hates sinners, and Jesus is the one who is a little more reasonable, and he'll a little more compassionate. Don't you understand? Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. The Father's no different than me. Jesus said, God so loved the world. That's God the Father. God so loved the world, the sinful world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish. These people are on their way to perishing, and God doesn't want them to perish. He loved them, and he sacrificed his own self in the person of Christ for them. That's not very ogurely. That's rather remarkably, astonishingly compassionate and loving. That's God's nature. But many religious people have seen God in the opposite way and portrayed him in the opposite way, so that when you speak and say, what you're doing is harmful, no one knows any other way to take what you're saying, but you're hating me. And of course, part of that is due to the fact that our society a long time ago, at least since the sexual revolution in the 60s, began to define sex as the one entitlement that no one should ever be denied. You might not be rich, you might not be, well employed, you might not live in a good neighborhood, but you certainly have every right to have sex with whoever you want to have sex with. And, how dare anyone tell me who I can't have sex with? I don't hear it so much anymore because the slogans in the movement, they come and go. But one of the slogans you may remember not too many years ago is, you can't tell me who I can love. I've never tried to. I don't even have an opinion about who you can love. In fact, my opinion is you should love everybody. I do. I think God wants you to. Love everybody. I'm talking about who you have sex with. That's not the same thing as love. A rapist is having sex, but he's not loving. Sex and love are not the same thing. Yeah, I know that our society more and more doesn't think of the word love without sexual connotations. When they read, Jonathan loved David. The love of David and Jonathan was like more than the love of women. Hardly anyone now reads that with thinking, oh, they're gay, No, the Bible does not assume that the word love has anything to do with sex. Sex, hopefully, will have something to do with love, but the word love does not imply anything sexual. Jesus loved his disciples. And some people want to say, well, he was gay too. No, he was not gay. He had the love of God. God is not gay. And God's not even sexual. And the love that Jesus had for his disciples was not sexual. The love that David and John had was not sexual. But if it became sexual, it would have been sin. And, in the law, which Jesus, by the way, upheld all of the moral standards of the law. The ritual standards of the law, he didn't care that much about those. But the moral standards of the law, he did, and that would include the sexual standards, because the word fornication that he used in the context of his culture meant all of those things that the law says are sexual deviancy. And we've named several of them. But when it comes to homosexuality, the law said something that Jesus obviously would have included, like everyone else in his society did, under the rubric of fornication. And that is in Leviticus 18, verse 22. Almost all gay people in churches have heard this one, and they've got their own ideas about what it means different. But what God says, you shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It's an abomination. Now, Paul, of course, repeated some of those things. Men lusting after men was a high degree of corruption in a society, he said in Romans chapter 1. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, he said people who call themselves Christians but practice homosexual sex, like a whole bunch of other people that he lists who aren't homosexuals but have other sinful things, he says they're not going to inherit the kingdom of God. Now, it may be that people who want to practice other forms of sexual activity than the Bible approves of would like for us to grin and bear it and smile and hit them on the back and celebrate their marriages and things like that. Even to the point of transgenderism, well, I'm living my truth. So why can't I live my truth, and why can't you rejoice with me? Well, partly because your truth is the devil's lie. You don't have your own truth. Truth is another term for reality. Reality is a harsh taskmaster because it won't change just because you want it to. What you're calling your truth is not reality. It's your imagination. At least I see it as such. And because I love you, I will not lie to you. You don't lie to your friends. I'd like to be your friend. And I'm not going to affirm something that is not true. Just because everybody else has decided they'll affirm you now. In fact, there's so much affirmation of the whole transgender phenomenon that it's becoming one of the most popular things to become. Honestly, I'm not joking. Before this modern movement of wokeness, scientists had identified the phenomenon of transgender in about 0.03% of the population. Like 0.003 of the population, something like that, had this dysphoria, this gender dysphoria, where they wanted to be something different than they were sexually. This is before modern critical gender theory came along and said, well, gender isn't biological. Gender's just whatever you identify as. But, of course, that's just a theory, and it's not true. But the thing is, in nature, apparently sin, having corrupted the race, has corrupted different people different ways. And a very tiny percent have struggled with the fact that they felt like they're born in the wrong body and they're of the wrong sex. Yeah, but today, the number of, and by the way, they were all men. Psychologists used to believe transgenderism was strictly a male confusion thing, men who wanted to be women. Now, the vast majority of transgenders are women, vast majority, many times as many women want to be males and call themselves transgender. There's one girl who told me that at her high school, she counts about a third of the girls are now transgender. And I hate to say it, but transgender is the cheapest way to become popular now. If you're not talented, you're not pretty, you don't have an attractive personality, no one likes you, the best way to get a ton of friends is go on Facebook, say, I'm transgender. Hey, everyone high fives you and pats you on the back. Hey, let's hang out, because that's what the non-transgenders feel like they're supposed to do. That's called virtue signaling. I'm virtuous. I can prove it. I'll signal to you that I'm virtuous by saying, I think you're doing a great thing there. Christians, of course, are going to be under that pressure to virtue signal too, even under legal pressure in all likelihood. But Christians have the truth. And if they begin to say, it's a lot more popular to affirm the lies, so maybe I'll compromise on the truth. Well, then we're gonna be as crazy as everyone else. There's a verse in Jeremiah that I like. I have it here somewhere in my notes. Yeah, it's where do I have it in my notes? Well, I can quote it essentially. It says, "The wise men are confounded and taken. They've rejected the word of the Lord. What wisdom is in them?" Once you reject the word of the Lord, what wisdom is in you? The answer, the rhetorical question is implying none. If you dislodge yourself from the truth, and that's all that the Bible tells is the truth. That's all that God ever told us was the truth. Jesus said, I am the truth. You'll never find a lie in the Bible. You dislodge yourself from that reality and that truth, you've got no foundation. Jesus said, he that hears these words of mine and keeps them is like, that means does them, obeys them, adheres to them, is like a man who builds his house on a rock. And the storms come and it stands firm because it's built on a rock. But he that hears these words of mine and does not obey them is like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. It may look just fine until things go bad. And when the storms come, it just collapses, and great is the fall of it. Jesus is saying, you build your life on my words, you will have reason never to regret it. You might die for it, but you won't even regret that. Nobody has ever regretted dying for Jesus. But if you say, well, it'd be a lot easier, more popular, I can get out of trouble more, stay out of trouble more if I kind of just ignore what Jesus said about these things, well, you're building your house on sand, and it's not going to stand. It may last for a little while, but there are storms. There are challenges. There are trials. There are judgments of God that come on the earth. And the ones who aren't on the rock, they've got no stability. They're going to go down. I mean, that's what Jesus said. His word is the foundation. Now, sometimes the gay, advocates, there are gay affirming churches, by the way. They like to look at these scriptures and say they're not really saying what you think they're saying. When it says, that homosexuality is a bad thing in the Old Testament, it's mainly thinking of man-boy sex. Apparently very common in the heathen world is for men to have a boy. Nero did. A lot of the emperors did. And they say that's what Paul, for example, is condemning. He's not condemning loving, monogamous, lifelong commitment sex between same-sex people. That's not what he's thinking about. He's thinking about this exploitative pedophilia, really, of men who exploit little boys sexually. That's what Paul has in mind. That's what Moses had in mind. Unfortunately, I mean, although it'd be convenient for some people if that's what he meant, we're not allowed to really make the words mean what we would prefer them to mean. What God said is, for a man to lie with a man, meaning sexually, as with a woman, it's an abomination. 2 chapters later, he said, those who did so would be put to death, along with a whole bunch of other people who did other kinds of sins. I mean, it's one of those sins that was intolerable under the law. And so were a lot of others. I mean, it's not like the law just singled out homosexuals for abuse. An adulterer, a kidnapper, someone who practiced witchcraft, someone who worshipped an idol, someone who cursed his parents, they'd be put to death too. So, but the point is, it was certainly not an okay thing. Whether we believe in death penalties for people like that or not is entirely a different subject. And I personally don't, but that's irrelevant. The point that there was a death penalty on it means that God was very much intolerant of it. And that's all I would need to know if I'm trying to choose a lifestyle what does God think is good and what does God think is really intolerable to him? Because him not only tolerating me, but accepting me and being pleased with me is really the whole purpose of my existence. And when I was single, I had as much sexual temptation of a different sort as a single gay person has, I assume. And and frankly, celibacy was not any easier for me than it was for anyone else. And fortunately, I was able to marry. And that's one thing a gay person could say, you're different. You at least had the option of marriage. I did, but I wasn't sure I would. I would have liked to have married 6 years earlier. I would have liked to have found someone. It's not always easy to find someone you want to live with for the rest of your life. And many heterosexual people, many straight people, never find that person. I know a lot of people my age who are not gay, but they've never married. And they say, well, I'm just picky, you know? Well, okay. So the reason a gay person doesn't marry a woman is because he doesn't want to marry a woman. The reason a heterosexual person doesn't marry a woman is usually he doesn't want to marry any woman he's met either. They're in the same bind. They have to learn to be sexually pure. I was able to get married, but I had to spend decades as an adult single person. And so I know. I am very sympathetic for anyone who can't find a wife, whether they're gay or straight. I mean, I didn't like being single, honestly. But being a Christian isn't about doing what you like. That's just the point. Being a non-Christian is about doing what you like. Being a Christian is doing what Jesus likes, what God likes. It's a fundamental change. That's what repentance is. You can't become a Christian without repentance. What is repentance? It means changing your mind. To what? From what? From thinking that you're the one you're supposed to please to thinking that God's the one you're supposed to please. That's the fundamental reorientation that takes place at true conversion. Now, lots of people join churches without being converted. Churches are full of unconverted people. But we're not allowed to play with the scripture and say, well, this word means something different. Like arsenokoitai, which is the word that Paul uses in one of his passages in 1 Corinthians 6 about homosexuality. They say, oh, that's just talking about man-boy sex. But that's not true. The word arsenokoitai, every Greek lexicon, every Greek scholar who knows how Greek words are put together says that means a man who has sex with a man. It doesn't mean anything else. There's never been a reputable lexicon that saw it differently. People can argue that it means something else if they want it to mean something else. But, you know, when you stand before God, he's not going to say, well, what did you want it to mean? We'll go with that. I think he's going to say, what did I tell you? You know, sometimes, I mean, honestly, it's hard to do what God wants. But when you do it, there's a certain easiness about it because your conscience is clear. Whenever you do something that you actually know God doesn't want you to do, you might find some happiness at a very shallow level, but there's something deep inside that's kind of nagging you, saying, you know, I'm not really sure I want to die and face God at this particular moment. And I'm not just talking about sex. I'm talking about any kind of sin. You live in any kind of sin, you're not as happy. The devil's lie is you'll be happier. Do what you want to do. Yeah, I mean, like, how many happy sinners are there? Well, you might say a lot of them. They're all happy. Okay, maybe they are happy in a sense. Now, I don't think they're as happy as I am. Maybe they are. But I'm happy at a deep level where I say my conscience is clear. If the doctor said, you're dying in the next 3 weeks, I'd say, maybe could we shorten that a little bit? I'm eager. I'm eager to face God, you know? Maybe, is there assisted suicide a possibility? You don't. No, I don't believe in that. But the thing is, though, that we are in a society that's seeking to normalize what is not normal. Now, there's been a lot of change in the attitudes of our society over the years. I'm not saying that it used to be good. I don't think it's good now, but I don't think it was good a short time ago either. Back in 1956, a person without ever expecting any kind of criticism for his ideas, a psychiatrist, was writing about homosexuality. He said things that you don't want to say out loud nowadays because this was the cultural attitude toward homosexuality back in 1956. This guy is Edmund Bergler in his book, Homosexuality, Disease or Way of Life. And he said, the public has now become half aware of the existence of information previously suppressed. The perversion has become more widespread. As a result of the dissemination of misleading statistics, a new source of marital tragedy has been opened up by marriages of so-called bisexuals to unsuspecting women, and it has recently been discovered that homosexuality is a curable illness. Now, you're not allowed to say that publicly anymore. It's it's illegal to say that in California where I live. Probably here too. I'm leaving soon. And I didn't say it there, okay? I'm not saying it's even true. You know, I'm not even saying that homosexuality is curable. I'm not going against the modern mainstream of that. I'm saying whether it is or not, misbehavior is curable. If I was born with the same-sex attraction, I might never get over it. Just like I'll probably never get over my straight, opposite-sex attraction. I'll probably have that till the day I die. And maybe not just toward my wife. Maybe there's people that are sexually attracted to me that aren't my wife. Well, what am I going to do about that? I can't change what I'm attracted to. Jesus was tempted, just like we are, in all points, but he didn't sin. Temptation is not sin. When you're tempted to do something, and strongly so, and you say, well, this is just the way I was born. Well, maybe it was. Maybe it's not curable. Maybe you're always going to feel that way. I can think immediately of two homosexual friends, been homosexual from their early youth. They totally immersed in the homosexual lifestyle before their conversion. Both of them gave it up, but one of them, I talked to him like 30 years after his conversion. He leads the ministry in San Francisco. He's a Jewish guy who has a Christian ministry there, and he's homosexual. And I asked him, I said, brother, after being a Christian so long, do you ever kind of just have a lessening of that same-sex attraction? He goes, I don't know. I can't understand that. He said, well, he says, for some people maybe, but not for me, you know. He's lived single and celibate for, I think, 50 years now. He's about my age. He's been doing ministry about as long as I have. So, I mean, I feel so badly for him, but he's faithful. Another guy named Joe Dallas, whom some of you may have heard of, he was in the homosexual lifestyle, and he got saved, and he struggled against it, and eventually, I don't know to what degree he has temptations with it, but he got married and has kids, and he started a ministry years ago, back in, I think, the 80s, that to help homosexuals escape the lifestyle. And he says they've had a lot of success, not 100%. You see, if I said to you, if you got homosexual tendencies, you can be cured of that, I'd be making a false promise. Maybe you can't. That's not the issue. God doesn't dislike people who have homosexual temptations, just like he doesn't like people who have straight temptations or any other kind of temptation. He's not against people who are tempted. He was tempted. He knows everyone is tempted. What he regulates is our response to temptation. What am I going to do about it? Am I going to obey him or just say, no, I think I'll obey me? Well, if I'm going to obey me, then there's nothing different about me than a non-Christian, because that's what a non-Christian does. They obey themselves, their own drives. A Christian has made Jesus the Lord and King of their life, and meaning it's no longer it's no longer my will, but yours. Now, what are we supposed to do? We're out of time here. What are we supposed to do when our friends ask us these questions like, why do you hate gays and transgenders? This is so sad, because if you don't affirm them and say, hey, good on you, well done, then you're hating them, apparently. I can't remember hating anyone in my whole life. Anyone. I just don't have it in me to hate people. I've been a Christian too long. The fruit of the Holy Spirit is love. Even when I was young, when I was like in my 20s, I used to have to test myself once in a while. I'd say, is there anyone I can think of in the whole world that I know that I would not die for? And I couldn't think of a person. I pictured some of the people I found the most obnoxious, some of the people I hardly knew. That if it was between me and them, I'd go and say, take me, let them go. I mean, I'm not trying to be virtuous. That's just what Jesus did. That's what Christians are. He laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That's the measure of love, and love is the measure of being a Christian. I can't remember a time in my life that I would choose to save my life over that of some other person in danger. And that would include gays, transsexual. It doesn't matter. They're people. They're made in God's image. they're as valuable as I am. They're not less human. They're just like me. They are just like me. They're people made in the image of God who are trying to get it right and are really struggling with things that are part of our own nature, that the Bible says are in our nature, sin. And, I pity everyone who's struggling with sin because I'm one of them, So, I mean, to say, why do you hate me? I don't hate you. I don't have to affirm what you're doing to love you, love you. I can love you and say, I don't lie to people I love. You think you're a man, but everything that God made you is not male. And I'm not just talking about anatomy. I'm talking about genetics. You're male, you're female down to every single cell in your body. You can't change that. Now, you can say God made a mistake and he put a man in a woman's body. And I would say, well, the idea of a God who makes mistakes certainly isn't in my Bible, and I don't think of that. I think it's more likely that maybe you're making a mistake, but I'm not condemning you. We all make mistakes, but this, I think, is a mistake you're making. And I don't think you're going to be the happiest you can be if you live with that mistake. And it is a fact, I mean, this is statistical. Everyone who's studied this knows this. Among transgenders, the suicide rate is 20 times that of the suicide rate in the general population. This is not a happy state to be in. They're seeking happiness. They feel like, I've been living in the wrong body. I've been unhappy because I'm in the wrong body. Let me change that and let me re-identify, and then I'll be who I'm supposed to be. Well, apparently a lot of them don't feel that way once they go there. And by the way, a lot of transgender people started feeling that way when they're young. And that's why there's a move to let 3-year-olds now. Last I read was some psychologists say a 3-year-old's not too young to decide whether they're transgender. Lots of people say 5. Now, we won't let them get a tattoo until they're 18. We won't let them marry without their parents' permission until they're 18. But they can change the most significant things about their body irreversibly without anyone's permission. Why? That's the political mood of the day. That's why. The truth is that, again, this is a statistic, between 69 and 97% of children who feel like transgender, they outgrow it, usually when they reach puberty or sometime shortly after that. That is, they naturally outgrow it. What if you take those kids and transfer them surgically or chemically, which are the two parts of the process, and now a little boy who thought he was a girl, now he is as much like a girl as a boy can be. But when he's a few years later, he says, wait, I'm not a girl. Why was I thinking that, You don't let little children make life-altering, irreversible decisions that could ruin their lives. If they're going to transgender, let them reach maturity and make that decision on their own. Not these Munchausen by proxy parents who get all kinds of accolades for their virtue signaling. My child is a transgender. Let's put him on parade. Yeah, I'm treating my little girl as a boy. I'm treating my little boy as a girl. Let's bring the newspapers in. Let's get this on the 6 o'clock news. Why? It gets me a lot of attention to be. I'm so woke. This is, what Munchausen is. That's when a person seeks to get attention by faking sickness. Munchausen by proxy is a disease, or it's a mental disorder, where you seek to get attention by usually your kid or someone else that you're caring for being sick, being abnormal. It's using a child. It's child abuse. The whole transgender movement began with a man named John Money. He was born in, I think, 1921. He died in 2006. He was a New Zealand psychologist and sexologist. And what he's famous for is inventing the term gender identity and the term sexual orientation. And of course, he's famous for his research in that area. One thing he's most famous for is that he took 2 little brothers and raised them to be girls. And he forced them to do simulated sex acts while he took pictures of them. And it didn't work out well. They grew up and both committed suicide. I knew a man years ago who took sexual pictures of little kids, and he's in jail now. This guy is a hero. This guy's the founder of a movement. This guy, if you disagree with him, you're a hater. Well, maybe I don't hate children. I think if you do something to destroy the life of a child, that's more hateful than opposing you doing that, you know? This is the mistakes that people begin to make when they don't use the scriptures, they don't care about God's will, they know what they want to go along. If they're not themselves driven toward other forms of sexual behavior, they at least want to be accepted and commended and congratulated by those who are, because they can see the writing on the wall. They know what side of the bread the butter's on. In the future, those who are sticking with the old ways of looking at things, that is, those who are loyal to God and what he says, we're going to be the new Jews in Nazi Germany is what it's going to be. Not yet. Right now they're reserving that position for the unvaccinated. But once the COVID thing goes away, it'll be those who are still traditional Christians and still hold that God's word didn't make any mistakes. And we have to just decide. Now, okay, why do you hate me? We don't hate you. Why won't you use my pronouns? Well, it's not because I hate you. It's that I don't, words mean things. I've always grown up to use words to mean what I think. I don't think you are what those pronouns suggest. I don't hate you if you think so. I won't even say you can't use them. I'm not trying to interfere with your life, but you shouldn't have to interfere with mine either. I mean, if I said, I want you to see me from now on as a 7-foot-tall black basketball player. Well, I can't see you that way. That's not true. Well, but it's my reality. It's my truth. You hate me? You know, how come you can't affirm my truth with me? Well, I won't make you. If I'm that confused about who I am, I'm not going to ask you to be as confused as I am. I give you freedom to think what you think. You give me freedom to think what I think. If you think you're a girl when you were born a boy, you have liberty. I'm not going to try to deprive you of that liberty. But don't you try to deprive me of mine. Okay? Now, and the other thing is, what about the gay couple whose parents are Christians or friends are Christians and don't want to go to the wedding? This hits close to home to almost every Christian family now. It's interesting, too, because in the time of the Kinsey report, back in what it was, the 50s, Kinsey thought 10% of the population was homosexual. Modern estimates are more like 1 to 4% are homosexual. Still, I mean, that's quite a small minority. And yet, it's amazing that almost everybody, I guess there's only like 6 degrees of separation between everybody and everyone else. Everybody has an uncle or a niece or a child or a grandchild or someone who wants to marry a gay partner. And my nephews, one of my nephews is gay, and he married a gay partner. Well, his parents are Christians, and they were very perplexed about what to do. They didn't approve. They love him. They actually have him and his partner over the house all the time. They love him, but they don't approve. You can't make someone approve of something that they know from solid, sources is not what God approves. But that doesn't mean you can't love them. But it really is a crisis when they want you to come to their wedding. Why? If you don't, you look like a curmudgeon, to put it mildly. But the truth is, going to a wedding is your way of saying, I celebrate this. I believe this. I'm rejoicing in this. I am part of the audience to hear your vows so I can hold you accountable to keep those vows. That's why weddings are public, so that people will be held accountable for making their vows. And the persons who attend are implicitly saying, I'm going to hold you accountable to those vows because you're making vows I approve of. Even if I think you're marrying the wrong person, I still think you need to keep your vows. But I don't think you should make or keep those vows. I think you're making a mistake. And it's a very sad thing that people who do have other orientations, as we call it now, decided that they had to change the definition of marriage from that which it had been in all societies at all time, and to do so with very little deliberation, very suddenly, and now, when in fact society was already evolving to a very high degree of acceptance and celebration of their lifestyle, and even granting them, couples who are same-sex couples, granting them every right and privilege legally